everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am your host Muriel, and in this video I will be going over my thoughts about the very recently finished House of Leaves written by Mark Z. Danielewski. And this is basically part 2 of my reading vlog for the same book. But so yes, House of Leaves, that bitch, which I really enjoyed. It was very, very good, very happily surprised with it. Honestly, I really thought that Ergodic literature was not meant for my brain after my experiences with both Infinite Jest and, to a lesser extent, Pale Fire, written by Vladimir Nabokov. I actually have a review of that one if you're interested, and I do have a reading vlog with a review attached of Infinite Jest, written by David Foster Wallace, but I didn't like either of those. I suspect part of the reason why I didn't like them is because they are general fiction. This is very firmly SFF, and it is very firmly cosmic horror, but it's doing a lot of things. Of course, I invite you to watch the first video, the reading vlog. It'll be a bit long, sorry about that, because I will be going into spoilers literally here. I want to be able to freely talk about this book, so if you want context for all that, I mean, obviously I would recommend you read the book first, but if you're just interested in the book as is, then you want plot information, etc. So yeah, check out the first video. But so with that out of the way, let's get into it. First, I do want to note something which I just learned. This was apparently the author's debut novel, which, goddamn, respect. I mean, it's not perfect, it's not flawless, I do have issues with it, but that's a debut. I'm just like tipping my hat off metaphorically here, because wow. And it took him 10 years to write. Also, mad respect there. Mad respect. This is someone who took the time to craft something they would presumably be happy with, satisfied with, proud of. They took the time for their art to cook, so to speak. And I respect the crap out of that, because especially, well, this was published in 2000, so obviously the socioeconomic and political landscape wasn't exactly the same, but still, you know, generally there's strong pressure for artists to kind of just pump out stuff because they need to make a living. And I hate to get into that kind of mindset, but just quickly, I feel like this would be very difficult to get published today. Traditionally published, I mean, probably actually would have a greater chance of doing it through self-pub. But I feel like today, I don't know, publishing houses, and it's not just publishing, it's all forms of media and art, they're less likely to take risks on true artistry, sadly. So I'm not sure this would actually see the light of day today. But it did 20 years ago, and I'm really glad it did, because I really enjoyed it. Another thing I will say before I go into like writing structure, etc., is if you enjoy found footage type movies, I believe one name for this is analog horror, you know, like the Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity and Wreck, those kinds of movies. I haven't actually seen any of them, but I used to have a sort of friend who was a big horror aficionado, and he talked a lot about the horror movies. He watched Blair Witch Project, was one of his all-time favorites, and I've read a lot about horror movies. I'm just interested in horror as a genre, even if I don't actually directly consume it a lot. I feel like this could work for you if you're also a reader, because that's kind of the vibe it gave me. This feels like found footage horror literature in a way. Obviously, the ergodic nature of it helps with that, but I feel like it's a good parallel to found footage horror and then maybe found footage video game, sort of. And I'll talk about potentials for adaptation later with that. So with those kind of introductory thoughts out of the way, I'm going to broadly speak about like the writing and the structure. So not strictly speaking the prose or pacing, but just kind of the structure and formatting of the book as well. Kind of the, you know, the substance and form. I'm going to talk about the form. Again, there is some truly phenomenal prose in this book. Just beautiful bits of writing, especially when it comes to setting the tone and creating an atmosphere and eliciting this very specific feeling of dread or just unease rather than fright as such. I can't really say I was ever, well, I got pretty close actually to me feeling scared. I definitely felt the chills, you know, the proverbial chills. There's some just absolutely sublime, perfect writing with regards to that specifically. The introduction, as an example, ends with these couple of paragraphs that are just like heavy hitters and just 10 out of 10 delicious prose to set the tone that you're going to go into something that will make you feel uneasy, that will elicit this feeling of the uncanny, of the creepy, of the threatening, etc. And speaking of ending sections or chapters, a lot of specifically the chapter endings were also just kind of perfectly from a tonal standpoint and from a making you want to read the next page standpoint, from like a cliffhangery standpoint, if you will. It just made me want to keep reading because it would just end on this one sentence or a couple of words. I was like, oh, oof, I really felt that, but it's so good and I want to know what happens next. What is going to be the next implication of this or that point or bit of faux academia, etc., etc. So really very, very good writing in that respect. But then also, I was very impressed by the way the author handled different character voices and then styles of writing, because there's a lot of, again, faux academic writing in this book. It's a huge part of the book, and it's a fundamental aspect of its, well, format and ergodic nature, and the, I learned a new word because of the book, it's metadiegetic nature, so this kind of Russian nesting doll story structure. No, so the faux academic writing is very good with all the, there are real, I mean, some of the footnotes reference real academic texts or obviously works of literature, but then a lot of them are fake. Funny fact about that, because I didn't mention this in the rest of the reading vlog, but at one point a snuff movie is referenced in one of the footnotes to discuss the veracity of filmed footage, whether it's, you know, cinema or documentary filmmaking. And they mention this horrific movie that was shown at like the Cannes Film Festival that actually had a child or young teenager being murdered, and that the people who had viewed it weren't sure if this was real or not. And I was like, is what? And so I went to Google it and was directly sent to basically the Reddit for House of Leaves. They're like, oh, did this get you too? No, actually, I think this might be the movie that inspired this fake footnote. And okay, on one hand, I was really relieved that it was not a real movie, but on the other hand, it's horrific enough. Like, I know that there's a movie called The Green Inferno or something, you can look it up if you want, where animals were actually killed on set or even like vivisected and tortured. Like there's a turtle that's eviscerated, and that was a real animal. You know, usually it's like no animals were harmed in the making of this movie. In that movie, animals were actually harmed. I'm pretty sure the filmmakers actually faced legal action, I hope. So the fact that that exists and I knew of it, I was like, it's just about possible enough that this other thing had happened, but no, that it's a fake reference. But still, it got me, is my point. Because you can't, I don't think, no one but the most deeply committed nerds, if you're out there, my respects to you, will actually go through every single footnote. But I mean, in general, even when you're reading nonfiction and academic texts, a lot of people don't actually sift through every single footnote. There's a certain level of trust when you go into a work of academic literature, right? But so it's playing with that idea of like what is real, what is not real, what can you actually trust to be real? And that is, again, beautifully conveyed through the actual fake academic prose. But then there's also Johnny Truant's voice, which is very distinct, and then it itself blends in elements from his sick mother through, you know, the CPTSD, and then his likely developing schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. And then there are the character voices of Karen, Will Navidson, etc., etc., and even Zampano's writing, because he is collating the manuscript. So, I mean, that obviously links back to the faux academic writing. So all of that was handled very well, in my opinion, which then, of course, brings me naturally to the very fact of the book's ergodic structure, ergodic nature, formatting, what have you. The way, you know, the text is formatted is very bizarre and wacky in places, but overall, it does actually enhance the experience of the actual story. So here the form synergizes very well with the actual substance of this piece of literature, of the text. There were several instances where I felt like the feelings of unease, of mild dread were genuinely amplified by the way the text was actually placed onto the page. There's a certain point where Will Navidson is crawling through this little tunnel in the heart of the labyrinth, and the text is just this little rectangle in the middle of a blank page, and it gets narrower and narrower, and you can feel that almost claustrophobia. Or when, you have Will Navidson and the rest of the rescue expedition that are at the bottom of the stairwell, and then Tom is back up at the top of the stairwell, and so there's text that's just at the bottom of the page, and then there's text at the top of the page. All of that just, again, genuinely amplified the emotional tenor of the actual story that was unfolding through the text. I've never experienced that before, and hate to throw some shade on another work of literature, but for instance, with Infinite Jest, supposedly, from what I've read, the fact that if you have a printed copy at the very least, because that was not really the case with my ebook version, that you're supposed to like go from the main narrative back to the footnotes, and there's like footnotes all the time. There's just a lot of footnotes, and you're supposed to go back and forth and back and forth. That's supposed to like parallel or evoke a tennis match with the back and forth of the tennis ball between the players. But I just found it grating and annoying and immersion breaking. It just broke up the pace of the actual story that was unfolding. But here, the way the different parts of the book are actually put together, because sometimes you are invited to check out the appendices at the end of the book in the middle of the main text. But I don't know, I felt like the overall pacing that went with the way you were kind of invited to check different parts of the book, it worked so much better. There was a much better flow to it all taken together. And I mean, you are free not to even check the appendices until you finish the main story. Apparently some people do that. But like, I read the Whalestow letters basically a little bit after I came across the footnote that was inviting me to do so. And yeah, okay, I just took a reading session to go through them. And that was one of the best parts of the book. It's just so emotionally affecting. And it was just gut punch. And there too, the writing, like the epistolary writing and Pelafina's character voice came through beautifully. And then there's this letter that you're supposed to decode. It's not actually that hard. I mean, I started to do it on paper, but then after a while, you can actually just do it in your head, taking the first letter of every word to create new words and sentences. And you learn that this woman was potentially raped as an old woman in an institution, and she's all alone and in so much pain. And I just started crying. And then it just gives you so much more empathy for the character of Johnny Truant, and it informs your understanding of history and potentially the entire book as a whole. I don't know, I didn't feel like I was taken out of the story. It was just an integral part of the story, and it fitted very nicely all together. This wasn't perfect, mind you. Like, I can't say it was always flawlessly executed. Sometimes the Johnny Truant sections were just too long. They were just too long and kind of belaboring the point in a way, and then there were a lot of just, to my mind, largely unnecessary sex scenes that were just a bit cringe, and I get that it's part of just Johnny being a bit cringe and kind of a sad loser, sad lowlife. And it's sad because he had so much potential, and obviously he's a very gifted storyteller, which we'll get back to, and he is educated somewhat on his own, and he had a lot of potential, and he just, because of so much trauma and abuse, wound up where he is in life. But like, some of those scenes are just like really graphic, not unbearably so, but it was just kind of like, can we move on, please? Can we get back to the story of the house, or even the funky, silly academic analysis? So the balance wasn't always actually achieved. It wasn't always perfect, but overall, I would say that the pacing of the story, even taking into account all the places in where it cut with bits from Johnny or invitations to check out the appendices, overall, I think it really worked well. I really enjoyed it. I thought it enhanced my experience of the text, the story, and then its themes. And then, yeah, so there's the wacky formatting, because Ergodic literature go burr. But then there's also the meta-diegetic nature of the text, of the, overall containing story. There, too, I thought that framing device, that structural choice, was very well employed and executed. And you can kind of see so many motifs paralleling one another on the different levels of the story. The one thing, though, I want to say about this, and I saw this expressed by another reviewer on YouTube, I kind of agree with that. I think some people probably, although, if they're having fun with it, more power to you. Like, enjoy this book however you want, ultimately, obviously. But I feel like some people maybe get lost in the weeds of trying to analyze this book and find meaning. And I'll get back to this idea in a bit. It's a very smart book. I do have reservations of using words like that. I do think it's very thoughtful. It's very thoughtful and thought-provoking. Obviously, a lot of care and thought and love that's how I see it, went into creating this work of literature. But I don't think it's as deep and smart and geniusy as maybe some people think. I think there's actually a limit to the layers and to the layers of meaning. And again, I'll come back to this in my little section on themes and ideas, because a lot of the paralleling of motifs, I think a lot of that is just aesthetics. And it's beautiful. Aesthetics are important in art. I very much fundamentally believe that, and aesthetics have a value in their own right. I think beauty has a lot of value in its own right. Discussion for another day, though. But I think a lot of that, the repeating of motifs and parallels between this or that element, that's just fundamentally like aesthetics. It's part of the aesthetics of the work. I don't think it necessarily has intrinsic meaning in terms of themes or like what is the true meaning of this story. I think a lot of that is aesthetics, but very, very well realized aesthetics, mind you. I give full marks to that, but I think that's where it stops in a way. That being said, with regards to that aesthetics, there are things I missed. That's why I've been having fun watching other content on House of Leaves. Apparently there's a section in the book where the motif of the SOS is actually reflected in the way the paragraphs are put on the page, with like short paragraphs. It's like 3 short paragraphs, 3 long and 3 short, right? That's the Morse code for SOS. I had noticed these little dots too, or like there were dots between the paragraphs. I had noticed the little dots at one point, and I just kind of thought, I don't think I thought it was a typo, but I guess I just didn't really care at that point. And so that apparently also kind of spells out SOS. So it's just kind of a bit of extra fun with the structure itself. But is it that meaningful? I don't think so. Again, sometimes the format does actually add, I think, a bit of meaning, a layer of meaning, and a layer of feeling mostly. Like, again, it amplifies the feeling of like dread or fear or just being concerned for the characters and where it's going to go, and eliciting those, proverbial chills. But then in other places, it's just kind of like having fun with the aesthetics for the sake of it, and that's perfectly valid, obviously. And then the last thing I wanted to add about, the writing, the pacing, the structure, etc. I really don't think this is as hard to read as a lot of people make it out to be, or maybe it's a lot of people who haven't actually read the book and they kind of just see some photos of the pages and they're like, oh no, this is like going to be, so hard to read. I'm very sorry. I apologize if it sounds pretentious or it sounds like I'm, being one of those asinine people being like, get good, son, except here with the book. But maybe it's people who don't read as much or just don't read as great of a variety of books as someone like me or other more advanced readers. Again, I hate how pretentious I sound right now, but I mean this with, it's fine. But genuinely, it's not that hard to read. The prose is very good, which means it's fluid in a lot of places. Sometimes it does get a bit stream of consciousness-y, which I'm honestly not a fan of, but like, you can also kind of just speed read through that somewhat. And a lot of that's the thing, I think once you kind of grok what this book is about, or one of the things it could potentially be about, and how this book actually kind of works, a lot of the academic footnotes, you can just skip them. A lot of them refer to things that just don't exist, and I think they're just kind of amusing because they probably have funny, silly titles, which a lot of real academic papers often do, and that's the joke. And once you get the joke, it's okay, you can move on from it. I really only bothered with the footnotes that actually had added explanatory text that added context to what I was reading in the main story. But a lot of it was just like, this book is referenced, published by Oxford University Press. I didn't bother actually reading it out. I was like, okay, skip. Well, there's a point in the book, for instance, where there's like a square with a lot of words, and the square, it does go on for 8 pages, but once you realize that the square is just containing, basically, it's a list of all the things you could potentially find in a house. All the different kinds of flooring, all the kinds of stone you could use to make flooring, or walls, or the bits that go into a staircase or staircase railing, the electrical wiring, the pipe work. That's what it is. It's a list. And then there's like a regular version, and then there's kind of a mirrored version. I took a snapshot with my phone and you just, reverse the image. I was like, oh, that's it. It's not actually adding a reflection on the text. I mean, I think it's, again, one of these kind of aesthetic gimmicks that kind of are meant to amplify this feeling of disorientation that the labyrinth within the house itself elicits. But that's about it. Like, I don't think you actually have to scan the lists for deeper meaning. You can kind of skip it or skim over it. So that's what I mean. I don't think, like, once you grok that, it's not actually that hard to read. And as to the crazy, you know, upside down sentences, you just flip the book. You just sit down in your couch or your chair. You just flip it. I mean, unless you're disabled and you can't do that, obviously that's something different. But like for the vast majority of people, you just flip it around. It's not that. It's not hard. Like compared to something like Infinite Jest is actually hard to read because of the way it's written. A lot of it's just so dense. It goes over the board and over the top with stream of consciousness and stream of narration. That actually makes it hard to read because it's just tiring. This one is fine. Is it the easiest thing to read? No, obviously not. But if you're a reader, you can read this. Especially if you're used to reading fiction and then bits of nonfiction here and there, this is not hard. As long as you're actually engaged with the story. If you're enjoying what you're reading, it's not hard to read. It's fun, actually. After a while, I found out it's kind of like a puzzle. But if you don't like a puzzle in your literature, fair enough, this is not for you, and that's completely fine. But yeah, if you like a little bit of a puzzle in your books, this is actually kind of fun in a way, and then piecing it all together. I just want to clarify that I really don't think it's that hard to read. Like, this took me 9 days, just a little bit more effort than a regular novel. I mean, it is still ergodic literature, but it's not some like crazy hard mode challenge. It really isn't. And then now some thoughts about the story itself, or rather stories, plural, and characters and things like that, and touch upon, you know, a few theories, at least some I read about, because I kind of have my own theories, but I'll keep it for the themes, ideas section. Like I said, I think in one of the first vlog entries, the first thing I thought of once I'd read the book's introductory chapter was The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, which is a work of what I would call proto-cosmic horror. I guess it could be considered just cosmic horror straight up. I think it might be called that, or I have the idea that it's called that because it predates, you know, the big granddaddy of cosmic horror, H.P. Lovecraft. It predates him, just kind of like Arthur C. Machen predates Lovecraft. That's a Welsh author, I believe, and he also wrote kind of proto-cosmic horror stories. The Great God Pan is one of them. I read a little collection of his stories. I didn't really like them, but I was interested in exploring some of the potential influences on Lovecraft's writing, and so I read that, and I read The King in Yellow. It itself is a short story collection, about half of them being about a fictional play that drives people insane, and there's, you know, weird things happen to the people who read the play or hear about it. It's that kind of story. Also, fun fact, The King in Yellow is referenced in the very first season of True Detective, which is probably the best season of True Detective, let's be real. I really like True Detective as an FYI, but that book is also mentioned in that TV show. And I thought of it immediately in relation to House of Leaves, because beyond any specific interpretation you may have about the text and its true meaning, or true meanings plural, at the end of the day, you can't really deny that basically there are several people going nuts or becoming unhealthily obsessed because of a house. The Navidsons, or rather Will Navidson specifically, individually becomes unhealthily obsessed with his house and the labyrinth at its heart. And then Zampano becomes unhealthily obsessed, potentially kind of crazy around the edges, you know, trying to decode the Navidson record, this documentary, which also doesn't actually exist. So he created it, he imagined it, I'll come back to this in a second, and then obviously Johnny Truant goes full on nuts, crazy, develops schizophrenia. I mean, not because of the book, but like it triggers the development of his schizophrenia, him trying to like put together Zampano's manuscript, which all ultimately links back to his house and the motif of the labyrinth and echoes and the Minotaur, which I'll come back to. So here again, it's kind of a piece of media, a story that drives people insane with the need to understand it and to find its true meaning, when that may be very well, in all likelihood, fundamentally impossible. And that is a core theme of cosmic horror, as multiply illustrated by good old H.P. Lovecraft. So this is very much, again, it's, you know, it's all subjective at the end of the day, and that, remember that, actually this will be important for the themes. But yeah, in my opinion, and I know this opinion is shared by a lot of other readers, this is fundamentally a work of cosmic horror literature. Or at least it is certainly that in part. It is that maybe amongst other things, but it is certainly that. And then there's this other thing I kind of love about House of Leaves. It's that, well, intentionally, unintentionally, I don't know, and I don't really care because I strongly subscribe to death of the author. And again, keep that in mind because it'll be important in a later section. The book actually subverts the haunted house trope because a lot of people I've noticed online call this a haunted house story. It's not. If you actually think about it, a haunted house story, it is a haunting house story. The house haunts the people in it. Right? Surely someone else has thought of this, right? Like, it's not, there aren't ghosts in it. Some people think there's a, I really fundamentally don't think there actually is a monster in there or a Minotaur, but I'll come back to my thoughts on various fun theories. There are no spirits, there are no ghosts. The house itself is the thing, the entity that fucks with the humans inside it. And again, I say it, I don't even know that there's a will to this house. I don't even think it's an eldritch monster like Cthulhu and his buddies, its buddies. But yeah, the house, the labyrinth inside it, the labyrinth, it fundamentally is, I guess it's its fundamental nature. It haunts the people living inside it, fucks with them. Again, unintentionally, intentionally, who the fuck knows? So I love that, this kind of trope subversion. Again, unintentional, intentional, I don't know. Your mileage will vary, obviously. And then I also really appreciated House of Leaves' satirical nature, what I perceived as its satirical nature. Although, full transparency here, I probably wouldn't even have used that word on my own, but I've seen people make the case that there is a satire of academia in it. And I agree with the sentiment. I just don't know that I would have used the word satire, but I'll use it now. Yes, it's kind of a satire making fun of academia and how up its own ass it can sometimes get. And I say this as someone who likes academia, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, and thinking about things and cracking things. I'm a nitpicky bitchworm when it comes to world building, for instance, and I love finding meaning in stories and art and things. So I don't think there's anything wrong intrinsically about that at all, but sometimes, like anything, it can become excessive and lost in the sauce. Lost in the weeds, lost up its own ass, especially with some branches of academia. And I mean, it's hilarious how there's so much ink spilled about the fictional Navidson record by all these fictional academics about the real meaning of the relationships of the Navidson family members and the symbolic nature of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth in relationship to the Navidsons. And then, you know, Tom and Will are compared to, what was it, Jacob and Esau from the Bible, etc., etc. And then psychoanalysis specifically is mentioned a lot of times with Freudian shit and Jungian shit. And it's like, I hate psychoanalysis, just full disclosure here. I have no patience for it for lots of different reasons. But again, discussion for another day. And it's just kind of hilarious because you can tell there's a lot of fun being poked at these things here because a lot of it is stupid, at the very least very silly, and a lot of it is just stupid because sometimes a spade is just a spade and nothing more. Which is also something that will be relevant in the theming section. Well, I love that, and I would imagine that the author was familiar with academic writing, because I mean, it does read like that a lot, the footnotes and the kind of just, yeah, crazy discussions, and you know, all the schools of thought as to why did Navidson, I don't actually know how you're supposed to pronounce it, whatever. Why did he go back to the house? Was it altruism? Was it a need to possess, which is then, you know, discussed in relation to gender and blah, blah, blah. And again, I actually enjoy a lot of that stuff in real life, but even I sometimes have to, like, you know, I have to stop myself before I wreck myself in a way, because I know, like, it's actually not that deep. Come back to earth. Sometimes a spade is just a spade. Going back to the structure a little bit, I just kind of love how that actually synergized with the narrative of the Navidson record. Not in the way it made fun of academia, but actually this is the reverse of that, where I think analysis brings a lot of good things to the table. The way some of the academic discussions themselves amplify the feelings you get from the actual horror story with the house and the labyrinth. I mentioned this with the section on echoes, for instance, like what is an echo? And then there's a discussion of the myth of the Greek nymph Echo, and then the acoustic properties of echoes and what it means in terms of defining a space and distances. And then that actually ends up kind of amplifying the horror of Navidson going into the labyrinth for the first time on his own, and the feeling of unease, the uncanny valley feeling you get about the space, the liminal space. Yes, I'm purposely using that term, of the labyrinth. That was great. That was a beautiful synergy between very dry academic writing, just kind of like introducing, setting the tone of this kind of viscerally felt horror fiction writing. But then again, it also makes fun of it. So I really like those two aspects of the faux academia nature of House of Leaves. And then we all know that I'm not a character-driven reader, so actually I probably have the least things to say about the characters themselves, because that's not ultimately what I really cared about. That being said, because I know a lot of people hate Johnny, I did not like Johnny. I did not dislike Johnny. I felt very sad for him a lot of the time. I had deep compassion as someone who also suffers from CPTSD, though thankfully not for the same reasons as him. I'm very lucky that I've not experienced psychosis. I don't know what that's like, but that must be horrific as well. So I just felt sad for him. The Navidsons, I mean, yeah, I did feel kind of like, oh no, when Tom dies, because he was a nice chap. You know, that whole section where he talks to himself on the camera, because he's actually fucking terrified of being in the labyrinth, and he's like, Mr. Monster, don't eat me, because, you know, I eat a lot of junk food and I smoke a lot of pot. I will taste terrible. And it's kind of like, it's endearing, right? It's at the very least, if nothing else, it's endearing. So it's, and then when he dies, because he saves his niece, and it's like, oh no, you know, it's that feeling. But nothing beyond that. And Karen and Navidson, I mean, it's touching that Karen overcomes her claustrophobia, and, you know, I respect the love that is displayed there. I think that's beautiful. Also, speaking of finding patterns and motifs and shit in the book, that whole she goes into the labyrinth to rescue her husband, it's actually kind of interesting that is not actually mentioned once, even in the footnotes, because it does reference a lot of mythology, especially Greek mythology. No mention whatsoever of, you know, the kind of mytheme of the descent into hell. I guess Dante's Inferno is referenced a few times. So I guess that would be the stand-in for that, Dante going into hell. But I feel like Orpheus and Eurydice, really nothing. Because that seemed to me the more obvious mythological parallel, except here it's reversed, because with Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus goes into the underworld to try and rescue Eurydice and famously fails because he looks back, right? But here, the woman goes to rescue her male partner and she succeeds, right? I don't know. I just thought of that immediately, but that was not at all referenced. Not that, I mean, so many things are already referenced in the text, right? But that's what I thought of in any case. That was moving, I guess, like the kind of romantic love that is displayed there. But I can't say that I felt super deeply emotionally invested with either of them or the other characters. And then there's Pelifina, Johnny's mother. There again, I just felt very deep sadness for this woman and compassion, and just kind of like, it's so unfair in a way that you wound up in this institution and you're all alone and you're obviously in a lot of pain because of the hell in your head. But that's about it. And then there's Zampano, who I guess for me remained the most mysterious figure in the actual story. But then I know there are theories about that. And so I do want to touch upon a couple of these theories here. Interestingly enough, I did not pick up on this at all on my own. I'd actually heard of this when I watched that video, but then I went to rewatch that same video, and I'll link a lot of these videos and extra resources if you're interested. But I went to rewatch this, again, group review of House of Leaves done by the good folks at Unresolved, Textual Tension. And I'd forgotten that I'd heard this in their review, because again, I watched it before reading the book, but then I rewatched it after I'd finished. So you remember this very strange story that concludes Johnny's narrative in the book, which I found very confusing, of this woman gives birth to a baby that has holes in its brain, so it basically can't live, and she talks to it very softly, sings to it for 4 days, seemingly without taking a break to sleep or go to the bathroom, and the staff is very moved by this and fascinated. And then eventually she's like, okay, I'm ready to let the baby go, but first can I have a moment with it before you unplug it? And then she, you know, it's moving, right? Like she's caressing the baby's head, kisses it, and then says, you can go now. Like it's literally moving. And then as soon as the words escape her mouth, the baby flatlines, and it says, "The child is gone." I think that's the very last sentence of Johnny's story. I was very confused by this. I was like, I have no fucking clue what that's about. Also, I remember expressing confusion about Johnny stating that no, his mother had not tried to strangle him. He actually remembered just clinging to his mother's wrists as she was taken away to the institution. Again, I don't think there's actually one correct reading of any of the stuff in the book, but it seems most people agree that that's simply Johnny telling himself a story because he's fundamentally incapable of processing the trauma. And so he can't accept that his mother actually tried to kill him because of psychosis. Eventually he's just like, no, that's a fake memory. What actually happened was just her being taken away and me being distressed by it. So that's actually a lie that he tells himself. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to accept that as the correct answer. But so the baby story. So apparently there's this theory for House of Leaves that the entire thing, the book, presumably, was in fact created by Palafina. So Johnny's schizophrenic, presumably, mother. It's all a figment of her imagination or just something she created for herself to give meaning to her life and suffering, and that so she basically gave birth to a baby that holds in its brain and died, and so she was never able to get over the loss of her baby. And so Johnny Truant actually never existed. She made him up. I mean, that's the baby she gave birth to. She called it Johnny, but then she created this life for him and everything to do with Zampano. Okay, my take is you can read it that way. I choose not to, ultimately, because I feel like it kind of, not fully, but I feel like it cheapens some of the nuances and layers of the story. Ultimately, it doesn't actually affect the theming, which I'll get to, don't worry. But I don't know, I'm just kind of not going with, that's not my headcanon. Let's leave it at that. And then there's another theory I heard that apparently some people think that Zampano and Johnny Truant are the same person. Again, I think you can read it that way. I did not, because I feel like there are too many inconsistencies with that then, but again, who knows? Apparently there's also textual evidence for Zampano having had a son. I guess, yeah, there is a poem or a journal entry in one of the appendices that kind of point in that direction, but some people really seem to like take this as fact that he had a son and the son died or he became estranged, and so the book is then kind of his baby. I'll be frank with you, I don't really care. Because of the themes I got out of the book, I don't actually really care all that much. One thing I will say though, I still don't really understand where the claw marks in Zampano's apartment came from. That is never addressed again. And then, well, no, because I remember saying that I wasn't sure if the Naviton record was, in fact, not real, but then it's just, there's too much overwhelming, again, evidence that, yeah, the Naviton record within the world, the reality of the book, does not exist. But, I mean, you never really then know why or understand why Zampano even created this in the first place. Because, I mean, there is the thing that he's blind. Now, you don't really know when he became blind, but presumably, like, there's no way he would have become blind after the Naviton record, given the kind of timeline you're given for all of that. So that in itself is very sus, right? It's like, well, you wouldn't even have seen the movie. I guess you could have someone describe it to him, but there's too many ifs, and yeah, it gets a bit complicated. So sure, yeah, the Naviton record doesn't exist. It was a work of fiction created by Zampano, but still drove him nuts. Not like Johnny, but clearly he was obsessed about it, and he became a recluse because of it, etc., etc. But to say that they're both the same person, I don't know. Usually, kind of, I'm not a huge fan of endings which can be summarized as, it was all a dream, it was all a delusion, and just big ambiguity around what is real and what isn't. I say usually, not always. I mean, sometimes I can enjoy an open ending or an ambiguous ending or an ending that plays with the nature and validity of reality. But usually it doesn't really work for me, and here it did. I don't know. The ambiguity here is fun more than anything else. And again, I don't really subscribe to a specific theory in terms of narrative meaning, because this is where I'm going to go into like hot take territory. I don't even know that it's a hot take, but this is what I think, and this is how I interpreted the book, and this is what I got out of it, and this is my headcanon. For me, the big theme of House of Leaves, the big thesis of House of Leaves, is none other than death of the author. For me, this is one giant very well executed cosmic horror story that is most of all about the concept of death of the author. Because there is so much in this book about the idea of interpretation and about perception shaping reality and your own reality, and about finding meaning that is specific to you, and about meaning being shaped by the individual seeking it. There's even like straight up quotes that are like, that was in the part with the labyrinth of like, the labyrinth is a stable construction you can appreciate the architecture of if you look at it from the outside, looking at blueprints, etc. But when you're in it, you're confused by it because it's your perception and your vantage point that shapes the meaning of a space, of a thing, of a concept, of an experience. Then there's even a quote in the book that was like, yeah, exactly, that's my freaking point. Truth transcends the telling. So for me, it's kind of like whatever the contents of the actual story, the truth you get out of it transcends that, because it is informed by who you are and what you bring to the story. And then there was also this passage about, you know, Johnny is preserving everything that Zampano wrote because that is all that is left of him, because a work of art, or just a creative work, because here it's fictional, non-fiction at the end of the day, it is something that emanates from a person. And again, I have this very long kind of like discussion and explanation of what I believe about separating the art and the artist. I don't think that when you create something, it's a one-to-one expression of who you are as a person. It's way more nuanced than that, but it is ultimately something that comes from you. And a lot of the time, art does express something about you, but people outside of you might not know exactly what is being expressed. That is still something that fundamentally belongs to you, and you're free to share it or not with other people. But then there is also interpretation. That's the other side of the coin, or this kind of like, what I call it, this double lens of like meaning. And that's what it's about ultimately, that how you interpret something also is informed by who you are. Interpretation, ironically, is also a form of expression, right? And so the meaning in art, in something created, emerges from the synergy, the alchemy of the meaning put into it by the creator and the meaning put into it by the interpreter, the reader of art, because there's this whole thing about the etymology of the word reading. So for me, that's the point, in a way. And that's why I don't think there is a single true meaning explanation for the actual narrative bits of the book. And that in itself is kind of brilliant. And again, because I fundamentally subscribe to death of the author, and because I think that's what the book is about, I don't even freaking know if that was the author's intent. And I don't care. This book made me feel very validated in my own like reading ethics and philosophy in a weird way. I don't think it's just about that though. I think that's kind of like the all-encapsulating theme of House of Leaves, with also very directly attached to it this kind of corollary sub-theme of the need for human beings to make sense of things, to find meaning in things. This, I think, is illustrated in a few different ways in the book. There's finding meaning in your past, in your pain, because there's a lot of trauma going around in that book. Finding meaning in your relationships. There's a lot written about family and relationships between parents and children, and I don't know, romantic relationships. And then finding meaning in your relationship to a thing, a space, the house, the notion of the home, the frickin' labyrinth itself, and, well, the pieces of media and art that arose out of the fictional house and labyrinth, right? Finding meaning in the fucking Navidson record, finding meaning in Zampano's manuscript, and then the readers. That's why I like how, I mean, again, I don't think it's an infinite amount of layers, but there are a few of them. The meaning that readers of House of Leaves tried to find in fucking House of Leaves. It's like I talked about the meta-diegetic nature of House of Leaves, but I think you can also use the concept of fractals with this book. It kind of fractalizes because it just, well, the meaning of the spiral, right? I mean, it's the labyrinth in this case, but on the cover of the book, the center of it takes the shape of a spiral, a kind of nautilus shell type spiral. So yeah, it's like On and on it goes, like different levels of like, we're seeking meaning, we're seeking meaning, we're seeking meaning. Oftentimes, that drives us crazy because sometimes you can't find meaning or you can't find a fixed singular meaning for something, which I think personally bothers some people more than others. I think that actually bothers me less. That's the thing. I don't know if this is because, so I'm going to be a bit out there for a second. I don't know if this is because of our monotheistic heritage and religion, this need for having one singular of anything, like it must have one singular meaning, we must have one singular loved person in our lives, we must have one singular all-time favorite thing. And I'm kind of like, multiplicity is good, bro. I don't know, why does it just have to be one? It's very black and white. It's very like the Cartesian binary thinking that is, again, very informed by the history of Western thought and patriarchy and religion. But again, a discussion for another day. That was my little tangent. But so yeah, I think some people do want to find one true meaning for a thing, and that's their right. I'm less like that, so it doesn't bother me as much, but I think that quest can drive you insane. Yeah, but sometimes you can have several meanings be true at once. I don't think there's a singular truth. The vast majority of cases, there can be several truths. There can be things existing at the same time that are not mutually exclusive. That's what I was thinking when I was reading about all those kind of schools of thought about why did Navidson go back to the house? And it's like all these intellectuals being like, there must be one singular reason why he did so. And I'm like, why not both though? Like, why couldn't there have been several reasons why he went back to the house? Why can't it be guilt and mild suicidal impulses and a desire for artistic perfection and a desire to atone for his brother's death? Why can't it be all those things at the same time? I don't get... See, that's what I mean. Multiplicity is good. So that's what I mean. I feel like there's several ways you can interpret this story. That's kind of the point. So it's like death of the author paired with the quest for meaning. And in a way, I feel like death of the author encourages the search for meaning and the search for your meaning, for the meaning that is relevant to you. And that's what we do in any case when we read or watch something. I mean, some people perhaps rely entirely on others' opinions to give them the correct meaning, but really, if you are a curious person and imaginative and creative, you will naturally seek out your own meaning. It doesn't mean you can't research things and engage with others to maybe reconsider something or consider something that you'd never thought of. That's very enriching too. I think that's a very good thing, but ultimately we also just kind of on our own get meaning that is specific to us out of art and media and things like that. And so in this case, I think death of the author is a good thing. It enhances, it amplifies the quest for meaning and it rewards it. But of course, at the end of the day, we're also in the territory of cosmic horror. And so the other side of the coin of the quest for meaning is that sometimes it drives us insane because sometimes we can't settle on a meaning. Again, either because we need one singular true meaning and that might simply not exist, or because we can't actually find meaning at all for whatever reason. Maybe because it just doesn't exist or because we can't grasp it, because something might remain unknowable. And because it is unknowable, we can't grasp its meaning. And then our brains explode. That being said, though, yes, I got other thematic threads, currents in House of Leaves that I think a lot of people will find as well. But ironically, I feel like that's the more superficial stuff. What I would focus on is basically trauma and relationships, which, is very broad, I know. But that is kind of what you find on every level of the story. You have the disintegration and then reconstruction of a family and the Navidson record, and there's trauma in Will Navidson and Tom Navidson's past. There is potentially really bad trauma in Karen's past. The freaking children, let's be real, will have been traumatized by their experience with the house. So there's that. Then even Holloway is described to be suicidal at one point, right? So he's also traumatized. I mean, yeah, Will Navidson is also traumatized by his work as a photojournalist because he went to a lot of war zones and things like that. And then, okay, Zampano might be the weakest link there, but he was an old man living on his own as a recluse in his apartment. He gets all these young women to read books to him. He sounds like a very lonely person and he's blind. So that perhaps might not be trauma as such. But then, I don't know, when you read the footnotes at times, maybe that's why people think he had a son, or he has a son who became estranged. There's a whole bit about the Minotaur and it actually being a myth about a deformed child that King Minos had to yeet into a labyrinth to keep away from public awareness, but then he felt terribly guilty about that. Maybe Zampano had a brother too, and that's why he wrote that whole thing about Jacob and Esau and, Will and Tom Navidson. I feel like, yeah, there's a lot that's just kind of left unsaid about Zampano, but a lot that is potentially very heavy and sad, but I'll admit is kind of the weakest link. That being said, though, I think the idea of relationships at least still holds, because he is very alone, but he definitely seems like he doesn't want to be, because he gets all these women to read text for him, and I think he's obsessed with his book, but I think he also enjoys the company of these readers and reference gatherers. And then there's also the idea that the book is his baby, and so there's a relationship between him and the manuscript, between creator and creation. So the idea of relationship at least still holds with Zampano, and then obviously there's Johnny. Johnny is a walking, what do you want to call it? He's just trauma. Right? He's trauma. He lost his dad when he was a child. He lost his mother when he was a child. He was almost killed by his mother, who is schizophrenic or something related to that. Then he was bounced from foster home to foster home. He had a very abusive foster father for a while. He went to different boarding schools. He'd get in fights with kids. He ends up being poor, uneducated. Well, he seems to be somewhat self-educated, but like no real qualifications, takes a lot of drugs, and then the descent into hell starts, right, with him putting together Zampano's manuscript. And then there's Palafina, who is, suffers from a psychotic disorder that causes her a shit ton of pain. She might have been raped by some attendants at the institution she was put in. Lots of trauma, suffering, pain, and then this kind of recurring idea of trying to deal with that, and then Johnny thinking about his mother, who was the only person who remained that loved him. But then she was also kind of manipulative, and she put a lot of pressure on the child because she basically expected Johnny to save her and give her the emotional attention she needed. But she was an adult and he was a child. She was parentifying Johnny, and that's very unhealthy. So, relationship and trauma. Yeah. Specifically, I guess, familial relationship more than anything else. Although there's Karen and Will Navidson. That's more a couple relationship, obviously. But I guess at that point it becomes familial. You know what I mean? And there is also a lot about parents and children specifically, because a lot of the trauma comes from parents, either from parents being manipulative, being abusive, being absent, etc., etc. And then again, this idea that the manuscript is a baby and there are different people parenting it, and that's an unhealthy relationship. So all of that, yeah, relationships and trauma. So I think that's definitely in there. And then that itself ties back to the quest for meaning, because a lot of times we seek to find meaning in our trauma and in the painful things that happened with loved ones and family members, etc., etc. But for me, I'm sorry, it remains the more superficial theme, ironically, I guess. But it is echoed. Yes, I said I would come back to this. It is echoed through the book's different layers. And here I'm going to get a bit out there again, but since that's kind of the deal with this book, right? That's what people have fun with House of Leaves. So this is my little contribution to like finding meaning and, applying symbols and motifs and shit. You have, the Minotaur, the Labyrinth, and Echoes. To me, those are the prominent motifs. Obviously, there are other motifs, right? There's the descent into hell that's really only represented by Dante's Inferno. There's the idea of the expeditions up Mount Everest, or like the expeditions to find the Northwest Passage, and that going horribly wrong. A lot of the horrors like compared to those things. But so the three big ones: Echoes, Minotaurs, and Labyrinth. So for me, if I had to like apply them on a thematic level, the big theme I mentioned of like death of the author, and then the quest for meaning, all kind of channeled through cosmic horror, that's the Labyrinth. And the house. They're one and the same at the end of the day, really. The Labyrinth, it is the thing that contains it all. It is the structure. It is the entity at the heart of it all. So that to me is like the thing. And then the Minotaur that kind of bops around in the Labyrinth, that's more the theming on trauma and relationships and family, and then making sense of all of that, finding meaning in those things, to positive effect or to perdition, as the case may be. That's the Minotaur. That's the creature lost in the Labyrinth, in a way. And then all of that is echoed. Like each of these motifs echo themselves through the text, through the different layers of the story. In the Navidson record, the Zampano manuscript, and then Johnny putting it all together, and then even potentially just Pelafina having just imagined it all. That's the thing I said. I don't really actually care what is the correct interpretation of the story. Yeah, maybe Palafina hallucinated it all, but I feel like the theming still ultimately works, which is what matters the most to me. But so yeah, the Labyrinth of Death of the Author, the quest for meaning, the Minotaur of like trauma, relationships, and making sense of all of that, just kind of getting lost and twirling around in the labyrinth. And all of these things, they echo one another and they echo themselves throughout all the layers of the story, which itself is the labyrinth. It was definitely ideas-driven SFF, which is my favorite kind of fiction, period. But it was fun too. Like, it's fun. It's very fun too, in a way. It's very thoughtful, but it's very fun at the same time. Honestly, it's kind of the vibe I usually get with China Miéville's fiction. Although this is very different. But then they're like, oh, what would China Miéville doing Ergodic fiction look like? Now I kind of want that. Anyone else? And then one last thing with kind of the ideas and the themes. There is a poem in House of Leaves. So that's in one of the appendices. There are poetic fragments, which I guess you're supposed to understand were written by Zampano as well, right? Because it's all his written material at the end of the day. Let me see, I need to find it. There we go. So let me read it out to you. Little solace comes to those who grieve, when thoughts keep drifting, as walls keep shifting, and this great blue world of ours seems a house of leaves, moments before the wind. Now, I kind of love this little poem, because again, you can actually interpret it a few different ways, and in relation to the different layers of the story and the ideas within the stories. One of the YouTubers I watched talk about this book was on the page, that the poem is kind of like the thesis of the book, and that it's ultimately about life and grief and loss and trauma. That the House of Leaves is life, and that it's impermanent, it's temporary, right? Life is a blip, and you have to enjoy it while it's there. And there's something sad but also beautiful about that. You know, House of Leaves is actually a very pretty image if you think about it, right? But eventually the wind will blow it all away. And you could think about sanity the same way, or youth, all those things. But I actually read it a different way. I'm sure there are other people who also read it that way. I actually think the House of Leaves is a book. Because a book, stick with me, is a house made up of leaves. And you're like, no, it's made up of pages of paper. Okay, etymology time and linguistics time. I am native in French as well, and there's a lot of French in this book, and Latin, and bits of German and Spanish as well. In French, the word for sheet of paper is the same as the word for a leaf on a tree. It's feuille. It comes from, well, I'm not sure that's the actual Latin root word, but it all ultimately derives from folio. Folio is a term used in English to refer to, like, you know, unbound books, I think. It's like groups of pages that would otherwise be bound in a book. But I know that the term folio is used in English. Folio Society, anyone, you know, it's a deluxe book company. It's called Folio Society because folio, in this case, refers to the pages in the book. So ultimately, it's the same word, it's the same concept. I mean, it's not exactly the same word because languages evolve, yes. But for me, with my knowledge of both languages and my little bits of knowledge about etymology, the House of Leaves is a house of sheets, is a house of pages. It is a book. Because what do books do? I mean, works of fiction at least. What does literature as an art form do? It contains a story and potentially a world and ideas and feelings and people within the body, the house of its pages, of its leaves. So to me, actually, the poem is referring back to the book itself, the House of Leaves, which is a book, which is a story, which has ideas and feelings, etc. And again, which refers back to Death of the Author. That a story is, it's impermanent, but there is beauty in the impermanence. And it's like, you know, before the wind closes the pages of the book, right? Like, that's why for me it's about a book, but then the book itself can be seen as a metaphor for life, because oftentimes, right, we talk about the story of a person's life. So again, it's multiple, like, it's echoes, right? It's things echoing one another, but I think ultimately I read it as pertaining to a book and the very act of storytelling and telling stories and finding meaning in stories in art, just like we try and find meaning in the stories of our own lives. Again, I'm probably reading way too much into this, but then who cares? I'm allowed to because death of the author. And so that's where I'm going to leave that in terms of theming, because I'm starting to sound a bit too crazy myself. But again, that's part of the fun. And I would love anyone who's read the book to tell me how they took, if they read it, because I'm sure there were people who skipped those poems, and again, that is completely valid. But if you have read that little poem, how did you interpret it, if you chose to interpret it at all? But for me, it refers to a book, but then it refers to a book as a metaphor for art and life itself. So I guess it's not wrong to see it as talking about life, but I think it's more the life within stories. It's the life within art, which then reflects back on real life. But then what is real, what isn't? Yeah, we could spend hours talking about this stuff. And I just wanted to touch upon a few little miscellaneous items, is what I'm going to call them. So since finishing the book yesterday morning, I've been watching and rewatching a few videos on YouTube about it. I rewatched this shortish video essay, which I had watched a few years ago about House of Leaves. That is really, really good. It's very nicely animated too. And it's spoiler free. I mean, if you've watched this, then you've already been thoroughly spoiled. Whatever, I still think it's worth watching. And I mean, if you want to recommend the book to other people and give them a taste of what it's about, you could recommend them the video as well. It's like 12 minutes long, and it doesn't really spoil much of anything. I also watched a really cool video about ergodic literature as a subgenre. Obviously mentions House of Leaves at the beginning, but it talks about other works of literature. I mean, I'm not really inclined to check out any of them, except perhaps one of them. I just thought it was interesting talking about the subgenre and some of the books that exist in it. Interestingly enough, though, Pale Fire was mentioned, but Infinite Jest was not. I don't know why. A bit more unrelated, but still ultimately related. I watched two videos back to back. The first was absolutely fascinating. I also play video games, and apparently, well, no, not apparently, just someone not that long ago, like a few years ago, released a mod for one of the Doom games. I think it's Doom 2. I've never played any Doom, just to be clear, but, you know, the video piqued my curiosity. And so someone made a mod for Doom 2, I think it is, because apparently you can create custom maps for Doom. Cool. And so they made a map called My House, and it is very, very clearly inspired by House of Leaves, at least in part. It probably has other sources of inspiration. Well, I mean, yeah, it has other sources of inspiration, but it notably very clearly is inspired and references House of Leaves. And it is really cool and impressive. Just all the little nods to House of Leaves are fun, but it's just very thoughtful. Like, it feels like fan fiction for House of Leaves, but that is itself kind of ergodic, which I guess is easier to do in any case with the video game format. But that's how I would describe it, like ergodic fan fiction of House of Leaves, kind of. And so I watched this playthrough that was also kind of a video essay at the same time, and it's just brilliant. And then that video sent me to another one that is a video essay about liminal spaces and the Backrooms, and then liminal horror. Because yes, this is cosmic horror. I will die on that hill. Not that I think I need to. I suppose you could say it counts as liminal space horror as well, because the Labyrinth, at least partly, is a liminal space, and that is part of what makes it so terrifying. And so, yeah, I did want to touch upon some of my remaining thoughts about plot elements of House of Leaves, the actual story. So did I think, I mean, keeping in mind none of this actually existed, but who cares? Is there actually a creature in the Labyrinth? I don't think so. I actually don't. I think the growling in the Labyrinth is the Labyrinth shifting and maybe just absorbing materials. I don't think there's an actual monster inside it. I think the monster is the house. Again, for me, that's more in keeping with the cosmic horror aspect. And then as to what the Labyrinth is, that's the point, isn't it? Of cosmic horror, we don't know and we'll never know. We'll never know. Like, for all I know, it's a Lego set put together by Cthulhu. That's what I'm going with. It's Cthulhu's Lego house. Yeah, with the Legos being made of star stuff. I don't, you know, it's a creepy, haunting house that reflects the psyches of the people who go into it, and we'll never know beyond that because, again, that's kind of the point of cosmic horror. But then you can choose to have an explanation, a headcanon, because that is the point of death of the author. And yeah, at the risk of repeating myself, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I would say it's ultimately between a 7.5 and an 8. In some ways, I feel like it's an 8 out of 10. It's that good, but I did have issues with it, right? The Johnny Truant sections, and then overall, I think all the different parts fit together very well. But it's not perfect everywhere. At times, it does feel a bit too disjointed. I'm like, well, how does this relate back to this? So my rating is Liminal itself. It's somewhere between 7.5 and 8 out of 10. That's what I'm going with. So there you go. Would I recommend this book? Absolutely. If this is absolutely not the kind of book that will work for everyone. Not even remotely close. But if you enjoy cosmic horror, stuff to do with liminal space, if you enjoy kind of layered theming and aesthetic motifs in your fiction, if you enjoy weird stuff, I guess, not even weird fiction specifically. I mean, a lot of this kind of horror, cosmic horror, just naturally crosses over with weird fiction in any case. So, you know, if you like cosmic horror, weird fiction, definitely consider this. And if you enjoy a bit of puzzling in your reading, I guess, then try this. I think it was well, also, like I said, if you enjoy the idea of found footage, but literature, or video games that kind of play with these ideas too, you know, the kind of cosmic-y psychological horror that you can find in some video games like PT, Visage, those kinds of games, but with less jump scares and monsters, but the kind of psychological aspect of those games, but you also like to read, then yeah, consider that. So if you're into all of those things, I would very highly recommend you at least try it. I'm happy I did it. You know what? I'm happy I did it. I'm happy I didn't unhaul it. I kept it for a reason, I guess. There was a reason that it stayed in that little cupboard. And so I read it, and now I can put it away in my actual library. Lots of fun. Thoughtful and lots of fun. A delightful combination, is it not? So that, I promise, will now be all for my, review following a reading vlog of House of Leaves, written by MyHouse.WAD Danielewski. I am aware there's a CD his sister made that is a companion piece of the book. I don't know if I'll check it out, but I know it exists. I hope you found this video and the reading vlog, again, enjoyable, interesting, engaging, entertaining, or that it simply allowed you to kill some time. That's perfectly valid as well. And on a very, very final note, I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, and thank you for watching, and, I'll see you all in the next video, whenever that is. But until then, bye-bye!